Well, the Alec Baldwin trial was dismissed with prejudice over a prosecution's error. But have you wondered what would have happened if the trial had been completed? Well, we're going to talk about that and a whole lot more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling, but they're calling it the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating and do not represent those of city, county, state, or federal law enforcement agencies, nor sponsors and platforms of this presentation. Charlie Crimebuster, charliecrimebuster.com, and peacemakernetwork.com are copyrights owned by Charlie Crimebuster. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Today we're going to talk about the Alec Baldwin trial. What would have happened? Yep, what would have happened if that had gone all the way to the jury, if it had not have been dismissed. We'll talk about that on today's program. Before we do so, let us give a welcome to all of those who've joined the Charlie Crime Train today. We appreciate you being on board the Charlie Crime Train. We'd like to urge you to reach out with a shout out. You can reach us, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. As we often say, you can ask questions. You can make suggestions about other podcasts. You can even make your objections. That's right. Ask questions, make suggestions, or make objections. In other words, if you don't agree with us, it's a safe spot. We would love to hear. And perhaps you might not agree with me on what I think that the jury would have said at the end of that trial. I'd love to hear from you. charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the program, go on over to peacemakernetwork.com. peacemakernetwork.com. There you can find how we promote those good, brave men and women who run toward danger instead of away from danger. Yep, we're talking about law enforcement, first responders, and of course the military. You can see all about that at peacemakernetwork.com. You can become a badge, BADGE supporter for as little as $3 a month. Hey, check it out, peacemakernetwork.com. If you'd like to get caught up on other episodes, well, go on over to charliecrimebuster.com. There you'll find all of our episodes there for your own information and your enjoyment. If you're a true crime fan, there's a bunch of it there for you to be a part of. So thank you again for joining with us, and let's get right into today's episode. You see, I guess we ought to start out by trying to give you a little background. It was in May of 2020 that it was announced that Alec Baldwin would produce and star in a movie called Rust, R-U-S-T. It was a Western-based story. He had actually created it with writer and director Joel Sousa. Now, Baldwin, he had told The Hollywood Reporter that, well, he was very happy to work with Sousa because he had missed that opportunity to star in Crown Vic in 2019. He also compared the screenplay to another film called Unforgiven, and he said it was actually inspired, this one was inspired by a true story. And when he was asked about his gun slinging and his horse riding skills, he says, they're always at the ready. I'm an actor of the old school. So if you read my resume, my motorcycle riding, my French, and my juggling, my horseback riding, the gunplay, well, they are all about my fingertips, and it's all right there at all times. Now, Rust is something about, well, it happened way back in Kansas. There was an aging outlaw there by the name of Heartland Rust, and he came to rescue his 13-year-old grandson, Lucas. You see, Lucas, well, he was sentenced to hang for an accidental murder, and now the fugitives are on the run. They have people chasing them. And among that was his longtime enemy, Marshall Wood Helm. And you know, what Western would not be complete without, right, you got it, a bounty hunter. And so, flash, here comes the bounty hunter, Fenton Preacher Lane. So now that's some of the background to remind you what the movie was all about. So now you get the gist of what was happening. It was in October 2021. Well, that's when they had to suspend the production. You see, Helena Hutchins, she was fatally shot. You see, she was shot when a gun was being used as a prop, and it was fired by Baldwin during the preparation of a scene. And also, Sousa, Sousa, the producer, was also injured by the very same round. Now, unfortunately, Miss Hutchins, she died on the way to the hospital. She had lost a whole lot of blood, so it was a very sad day there on the set. So let's go back to that tragic day. See, on that morning, according to, a report, there were 7 unionized members of the film's camera crew. Well, they staged a walkout. They were not happy campers. And later that day, though, the cast and the crew, they were rehearsing a gunfight scene that was taking place inside a church there at the Bonanza Creek Ranch, where that Western and a number of other Westerns have been filmed. So firearms and ammunition, they were retrieved from a locked safe, and armorer Hannah Jutris Reed, she placed 3 guns to be used in the filming on the cart. Among them was a plastic gun that could not shoot live ammunition. There was a modified weapon that could not fire any type of ammunition, and there was a solid frame .45 Colt revolver. Now, according to a search warrant, those guns were briefly checked by Miss Reed. She is the armorer. And then the assistant director, David Halls, took that revolver from the prop cart. He handed it to Baldwin. Now, in another affidavit, Halls, he said the safety protocol regarding the firearm was such that Halls, he himself, was supposed to open the loading gate of the revolver, rotate the cylinder to expose the chambers so he, too, could inspect them and make sure the gun was safe. But according to the affidavit, Halls said he did not check all cylinder chambers. He did recall seeing 3 rounds in the cylinder at the time. But after the shooting, Halls also said in that same affidavit that Jutris Reed, she retrieved the weapon, she opened it, and Halls said he saw 4 rounds which were plainly blanks, and 1 which could have been the remaining shell of a discharged live round. Now, in the warrant, it further stated that Halls announced the term cold gun. In other words, he announced it on the set, meaning that that gun was safe, that gun did not contain live rounds. So there is a trio of people who are behind the monitor, and they're all repositioning the camera to remove a shadow. This is during a time they were doing what they call blocking, not filming, blocking, walking through it. And Baldwin began to explain to the crew how he planned to draw the firearm. He said and I'm quoting, he said, quote, "So I guess I'm going to take it out like this, pull it, and go bang." But when he removed it from the holster, the revolver actually discharged 1 single time. Now Baldwin, he denied pulling the trigger of the gun. That's what ABC News described. But then there was a later FBI report that stated the gun could only fire if the trigger was pulled. Now Halls was also quoted by his own attorney. She said that Baldwin did not pull the trigger, and Baldwin's finger was never within the trigger guard during the incident. That's what Halls said. But when the gun fired, the projectile then it traveled toward those 3 people behind the monitor. It struck Hutchins in the chest, traveled through her body, hit Sousa in the shoulder. Now the script supervisor, Mamie Mitchell, she called 911 around 1:46 p.m. Mountain Time on that day. Emergency crews were there 3 minutes later. Unfortunately, footage of the incident was not recorded. Hutchins was flown by helicopter to the University of New Mexico Hospital there in Arizona, where she was pronounced dead. Sousa, he was treated by EMS, and then he was taken to the Regional Medical Center in Santa Fe, where he was admitted and released the following morning. So that kind of gets you up on what happened. Now, no one, my friend, has ever actually said or charged anyone of intentionally causing the death of Melina Hutchins. It was an accident. But did it have to happen? Could it have been avoided? And were those people there who the carelessness of other people on the set, did it cause the accident? And in those instances, charges can, and they were made. You see, in this instance, 3 people were charged. Hannah Gutierrez Reed, she was the armorer, and she was responsible for safety on the set with those weapons. And there was a second person, Assistant David Hall, Assistant Director David Hall. He was also responsible for the safety of that weapon. Remember? He handed it to Baldwin. He announced the weapon as a quote-unquote code gun. Code gun means it did not contain live rounds. Now hold on. Alec Baldwin, he was also charged by prosecutors, only for those charges to be dropped. But hey, hang on again. Later, those charges were brought up again. This time, a grand jury looked at Baldwin's involvement, and they brought back what is called a true bill, and they charged Baldwin on reckless behavior on the set with that weapon, and that charge turned into involuntary manslaughter. Now remember, my friend, this is a real gun. It is not shooting blanks, but so-called dummy rounds that appear to look like live rounds. Hannah Reed, she was charged with involuntary manslaughter and evidence tampering. David Hall, he was charged with negligent use of a deadly weapon in connection with the shooting. And Alec Baldwin, too, was charged with involuntary manslaughter through that grand jury indictment. Now, David Hall's case, it was settled first. He probably received the lighter charge because, you see, he cooperated with the authorities. He actually pled guilty. His sentence? 6 months unsupervised probation. And as a part of the plea deal with the fatal shooting, well, my friend, some have said that Baldwin was offered a similar deal, but he turned it down. Next, there was the trial of Hannah Reed. That trial went to its conclusion. There, jurors deliberated for about 3 hours before their decision of guilty of involuntary manslaughter. There, she was sentenced to 18 months. By the way, after the jury spoke that very day, she was immediately taken into custody after the verdict, even before the sentence. Now, this brings us to Alec Baldwin. You see, near the beginning, he was charged, but those charges were dropped, but not with prejudice, you see. So when the grand jury decided to charge him again, that sets him up for a trial. Now, prior to the trial, there was a lot of back and forth between people regarding the statement that Alec Baldwin made, that he did not have his finger on that trigger. It was a big deal, and people were writing about it, talking about it. The FBI, they had experts examine the weapon, stated the only way that particular weapon could have been fired was that the trigger was pulled. Alec, remember, said, I didn't have my finger on the trigger. David Hall said, I don't think he had the finger on the trigger either, although he took that back a little later. So, my friend, now we're going to get into the actual trial and what really happened in a moment. But right now, it is time for what we call Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook Story. So, my friend, our Crazy Crook story today has to do with the interaction with the Popo. Yep. Interaction with the Popo at a DUI checkpoint. As a street cop back in the state of Tennessee, I was a part of conducting a number of so-called DUI checkpoints. And I was amazed at how people would conduct themselves at these checkpoints. Oh, there were the runners. Yep, upon coming upon a checkpoint, they would immediately do a U-turn and tip the speed away. However, we always had a car ready to chase those down. Then there were those who would try to drown out the smell of alcohol and pot, before they pulled up. Oh, my friend, I'm telling you, you could smell so much perfume, so much cologne. Well, you needed to hand out a gas mask just to be able to breathe. But the one situation that stands out to me is another one that I want to tell you about. It seems that there was a young lady from Fresno, California, read about this in the Reader's Digest. She pulled up to a DUI checkpoint, no doubt a little tipsy, and realizing that she was in big trouble, well, she decided to get some brownie points. She got that by telling the officer this very helpful information. She stated, and my friend, you can't make this up, she stated, well, my husband's right behind me, and he's even drunker than me. Wow. Well, I guess you could say those who drink together, well, they may also get a cell together. Hey, my friend, let me do say, though, drunk driving is dangerous. Innocent people are killed by the actions of an intoxicated driver. Do not drive drunk, folks. So this lady who is so crazy that she decides to tell the officer, after all, her husband is behind her and he is even more drunk than her. Well, she does indeed become Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. So, what happened at the Baldwin trial? And if the trial had not been stopped, what would the jury have said? You see, it was actor Alec Baldwin who actually sobbed, embraced his defense lawyers after the judge in the Rust involuntary manslaughter trial. Well, they dismissed the case. She dismissed the case, finding that prosecutors had suppressed evidence. She went on to say, quote, the state's willful withholding of this information was intentional and deliberate. That's what First Judicial District Judge Mary Marlowe Summer said. And she went on to say, quote, if this conduct does not rise to the level of bad faith, well, it certainly comes so near to bad faith as to show signs of scorching prejudice. Now, in Baldwin's case, the evidence in question, well, it was ammunition that a witness had brought over to the state earlier that year. And investigators, they did not enter the ammunition into the case file, nor did they reveal it to the defense. In fact, its existence actually came to light on a day in the trial when Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office crime scene technician Marissa Poppel, she was being cross-examined on the stand, and she brought out the fact that ammunition had been brought to them. But even worse, they found out that the evidence was actually placed under another case file that had nothing to do with this case. It would have literally hidden such evidence from the defense. Now, my friend, there's actually a good chance the evidence would not have done anything to back the case. The defense may not have even used it or brought it to the attention. But the problem is, that is for the defense to decide. They have a right to see the evidence. The prosecution cannot take it upon themselves to make that decision and to hide that evidence. So, the case is out. It's over. It's been dismissed with prejudice. He can never again be brought to trial on those charges. But what about if this had not happened? How would the trial have ended? So let me summarize the evidence in the case from both sides and let you decide whether you think the verdict would have been guilty or not guilty. It really boils down to this. Here's what the prosecution is saying. The prosecution was saying that Alec Baldwin was responsible for the tragedy. In the earlier trial of the armorer, remember Hannah Reed, it was introduced that Alec Baldwin, as part producer of the movie, that he was responsible to make sure that safety protocol was followed. It was even brought out in Hannah Reed's trial that the film was very low budget, that they were pushing too fast to save money on the production, that they were hurry, even to the point that safety issues were ignored. It was brought out that Alec Baldwin did not seem to be very interested in the safety meetings that they were trying to hold, that they were often delayed, they were often canceled, not because of the armorer, but because of the producers and Mr. Baldwin. But there was one problem. You see, the fact of Mr. Baldwin being a part producer on the set, that fact and his responsibility as a part of a producer was not allowed to be brought into the case. The judge had ruled that Baldwin is being charged not for his part as a producer, but for his very actions on the set as an actor. So the prosecution is now saying, and they were saying it throughout the trial, that Alec Baldwin was very careless. Again, that he was not even listening to the safety talks. That he was going about pointing the weapon like a porter to point things out. Here's this, here's that. That he ignored, well, he not only ignored the safety talks, but hold on, he ignored what is called, and this was a huge part of the case, by the way, especially at the beginning of the trial, with the statement from the prosecution in the opening statement. The prosecution said plainly he, Alec Baldwin, ignored cardinal rules of gun handling. Did you get that? Cardinal rules of gun handling. And if you don't know those so-called cardinal rules, let me tell you what they are. Number one, treat every weapon as it is loaded. Number two, never point a weapon at another person unless you intend to shoot them. And number three, do not put your finger on the trigger unless you intend to shoot. Now, they would go about during the trial constantly, their strategy was to show how Alec Baldwin would ignore these so-called cardinal rules. So that's pretty well it from the prosecution. You see, had he not pointed the weapon that day, Hannah Reed, of course, was the one who was supposed to get the gun to him, but he had the gun in his hand. He was the one who pointed the weapon. Had he not pointed the weapon, had he not had his finger on the trigger, then that Miss Hutchins would not have been shot. So what would the defense say about all this? Well, first of all, got to tell you, they took away that argument that was so pressing in the case. Those people who were saying Alec Baldwin did or did not have his finger on the trigger when he drew the weapon during the filming while going through that scene. Again, they were actually doing blocking. And you could see another particular video where he did pull that weapon out of his holster. He did indeed have his finger on the trigger. But they said basically this. The defense says it does not matter whether he had the finger on the trigger or not. That's right. They said it doesn't matter. This was a weapon that was used in a movie. It was a weapon that should have never had a live round in its chambers. Actors point guns at people continually. It's called acting. Acting like you're pointing a real gun. Acting like you are shooting. Acting like you are having your finger on the trigger because that's the only way the weapon would shoot. They went on to say that's why you have an armorer. An armorer who is ultimately responsible to assure that there are never live rounds on a movie set, who checks each round every time the weapon is used to assure that that weapon is safe. They went on to say that's why you have an assistant director, who again is there for one reason, to assure that the armorer is correct in checking the weapon, and that assistant director is responsible for checking the weapon a second time before handing it to the actor. That was the same one, by the way, who called out, quote, unquote, "Code gun," announcing to the whole set, this weapon is safe. They're saying, quite to the contrary, it's not the actor's responsibility. The actor's responsibility is to focus on getting into character, to be that cowboy, to draw the weapon as if he's firing the weapon. You see, people have already been hired to assure that that weapon is safe, so that if it is pointed to people and the trigger is pulled, well, that person is safe. Only a dummy round would be fired, not a real bullet. And so the defense is saying, hey, it's the armorer and it's the assistant director that have that responsibility, not the actor. Basically what they were saying was Alec Baldwin was doing his job that day. The assistant director, the armorer, they were not doing their job. So that's really it in a nutshell, my friend. But let me ask you, what say ye? Is Baldwin responsible? Now, earlier in the series, we did a survey of our listeners. And guess what we found out? We found out that 52% of those at the very beginning of this trial, before the opening statements or anything else as we were preparing, 52% of the people that we surveyed stated they thought that Baldwin would be found guilty. But in all fairness, this was before the defense lawyers were making their case. So, what are my thoughts? Well, I want to tell you exactly what my thoughts are. Was he guilty or not guilty? Would I have voted guilty or not guilty? Now, my friend, let me say, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree he did violate the cardinal rules of gun handling. He did point that weapon. I believe he did have his finger on the trigger, and I'm going to urge you with weapons to always hold those rules sacred. But my friend, you do not have two people who are paid following you around to make sure your weapon is safe and that it cannot hurt someone or kill someone else. You and I, we're not actors acting a part. We do not put dummy rounds in our weapon and play cowboy. By the way, my friend, if that's something you are thinking about doing, don't do it. You should not do it. Never horseplay with a real weapon. But my friend, this was acting. This was acting pure and simple. It was supposed to be safe. And it had those people there to assure that there were no live rounds on the set, that the weapon was checked not just once but twice before being put in the hand of the actor and the announcement code gun. No, my friend, I think when it comes to Alec Baldwin, I think the verdict should have been not guilty. Not guilty. And I believe I'm backed up on that somewhat, because at least two of the jurors have now spoken out. And based on what they have said that they heard in the trial before it was dismissed for prejudice, they are all saying, or these two or three people are saying, they would have voted not guilty. And remember, it only takes one juror to hold up a verdict. One of those jurors actually said, I didn't even know why we were there. I didn't even know why we would be there on that case. There was no way that Alec Baldwin was responsible for this. But what say ye? Hey, I'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can disagree. In fact, I'd love to hear what you think about it. You can reach me again, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. What would have happened if that trial had gone to the conclusion with the jury deliberating? Let me know what you think the trial would have brought to the verdict. Would it be guilty or not guilty? What would the jury have said? But before we come to the close of the podcast today, I think it's only right to remind all of us, those of us who are not acting on a stage with several steps of safety to assure the safety of the weapon, you and I remember, number one, let's treat every weapon as a loaded weapon. Never point a weapon at someone unless it's intended to be used, and never put your finger on that trigger. Keep it outside the trigger guard, unless you intend to shoot it. Hey, by the way, join us this coming week on our YouTube channel as James and I will discuss this very episode. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about this and bring out some things that maybe you didn't hear in this podcast. Just go to Charlie Crimebuster /YouTube, and you can join us in what we call Charlie Crime Talk. That's every week after the podcast. Well, until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be alert, be safe, because the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.